Politicians are known for breaking campaign promises to their voters, and Trump has taken this reputation to new levels with his outlandish assurances, like erecting the Mexican border wall and scrapping Obamacare. We never know what ridiculous policies Trump intends to truly attempt, what he can actually get away with, and what is merely empty rhetoric. It's an interesting track record for a president who won a second term with a campaign slogan of promises made, promises kept. But his base has never seemed to care much about follow through until, of course, now. Trumpers are finally revolting in the wake of their president flip-flopping on his vow to release Epstein files. Will they truly abandon their king over this debacle? Well, only time will tell if Trump can survive the backlash. But one thing we know for sure is that the rich and powerful in our country will protect their own kind despite any and all political differences. So tonight, let's take a quick look back at the Epstein controversy and how it's been handled by all facets of government. As you may know, Jeffrey Epstein was a wealthy financier turned convicted sex offender who cultivated friendships with presidents, princes, and corporate tycoons. In 2008, he secured a notorious sweetheart plea deal in Florida for procuring underage girls, a deal that, of course, shut down an FBI probe and granted immunity to any unnamed co-conspirators. About a decade later, Epstein was finally charged with trafficking minors across state lines and accused of sexually abusing hundreds of underage girls over many years. The evidence seized was staggering. Thousands of photos and videos from Epstein's property, suggestive of an enormous scale of abuse. Epstein's arrest in July of 2019 sent shockwaves through elite circles as rumors swirled that a secret client list of powerful figures might soon be exposed. Just 1 month later, Epstein was found dead in his Manhattan jail cell, officially ruled a suicide. His death abruptly ended his trial and silenced the one man who knew the full truth of his operation. Epstein's demise only deepened public suspicion. How exactly did such a high-profile inmate supposedly kill himself under 24/7 watch, with cameras coincidentally malfunctioning and guards asleep? The conspiracy theories practically wrote themselves. Was Epstein murdered to protect his influential friends? Did he have compromise or compromised material on VIPs? And did someone ensure his silence? These questions have never been satisfactorily answered by authorities. What is clear is that Epstein's many victims, some as young as 14, never got the full justice or answers they deserved. Instead of a public airing of all involved, much of the case remains shrouded in secrecy. Years later, the trove of Epstein evidence, commonly known as the Epstein files, gathered by federal investigators, remains largely hidden from public view. These files include videos, photographs, flight logs, financial records, and personal black books, while the ongoing secrecy transcends any one political party, implicating officials from both the Trump and Biden administrations in what increasingly looks like a bipartisan cover-up. After Epstein's death, there were loud calls to release everything known about his operation. The public wanted to unseal the little black book of contacts, to publish the full list of prominent men who allegedly partook in his sex trafficking ring, and to expose anyone who enabled his crimes. Yet the federal government has consistently refused to release these Epstein files in full. Under former President Donald Trump's Justice Department, Epstein's co-conspirator, Ghislaine Maxwell, was prosecuted and ultimately convicted in 2021, but no other accomplices or clients were charged, even though Epstein's own records potentially implicated many. In fact, during Trump's first term, Epstein died in federal custody on Attorney General William Barr's watch, an immense failure that was never adequately explained. Barr declared himself appalled at Epstein's death, but accepted it as a suicide, and no high-level inquiry ever produced a clear account of that perfect storm of security lapses. The Trump-era DOJ also fought attempts to unseal certain documents from a prior Epstein civil lawsuit, suggesting a reluctance to shine light on Epstein's network. In short, despite Republican control of the government at that time, full transparency never materialized. When President Joe Biden took office in 2021, hopes for a nonpartisan reckoning with Epstein's legacy were soon dashed. Biden's Justice Department likewise did not volunteer any Epstein disclosures. There was no initiative under Attorney General Merrick Garland to declassify Epstein's files or identify powerful offenders who might have been involved. If anything, the issue went quiet as the media's attention shifted. This inaction did not go unnoticed by skeptics. Trump and his allies accused the Biden administration of withholding the Epstein files to protect Democratic bigwigs. The MAGA movement became fixated on the idea of a hidden Epstein client list, featuring figures like Bill Clinton or Bill Gates or other perceived enemies of Donald Trump. It became an article of faith in pro-Trump circles that the deep state was covering up Epstein's secrets to shield a liberal elite cabal. Ironically, when Trump ran again in 2024, he promised his base he would finally reveal the truth. On the campaign trail, Trump vowed to declassify the Epstein files and suggested that Biden's people had buried explosive evidence. His supporters, primed by, of course, years of conspiracy lore, were hungry for vindication. But once back in power, Trump's team changed their tune, quite dramatically, in fact. By mid-2025, Trump's own Justice Department announced that a comprehensive review, quote, revealed no incriminating client list, end quote, and no evidence Epstein had blackmailed any VIPs. A DOJ memo quietly affirmed that Epstein died by suicide and declared the case effectively closed. To believers of a cover-up, this was a gut punch. Segments of Trump's most loyal MAGA base erupted in anger, suddenly turning on their own champion for reneging on the crusade for truth. Right-wing commentators who normally back Trump blasted his administration's Epstein findings as a whitewash and obvious bullshit. Even Trump's former national security aide, Kash Patel, who once hyped the list, now insisted there were no sensational videos to be found, further infuriating the true believers. The result has been a strange political realignment. Hardcore MAGA populists and many progressives actually agree on this issue. They smell a cover-up. House Speaker Mike Johnson, a staunch Trump ally, broke ranks to call for full Epstein file transparency, despite Trump's Justice Department stonewalling requests. In July 2025, House Democrats nearly forced a vote on releasing all Epstein documents, and a handful of right-wing Republicans were poised to join them before GOP leaders blocked the effort at the last minute. If you're not hiding anything, prove it, demanded Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries, challenging the government to show the truth if you are trying to hide something, as many Donald Trump MAGA supporters believe. Clearly, neither party's establishment actually wants those files public, even as they point fingers at the other. Trump himself, after teasing revelations for years, now urges his followers to move on from the Epstein issue. Meanwhile, Joe Biden, who could have unilaterally ordered more transparency before leaving office, never did, whether out of indifference or because Epstein's secrets also threatened figures in his circles. Thus, across two administrations of opposite parties, the pattern holds: protect the powerful, bury the secrets, and hope the public forgets. Now, why would officials of both parties go to such lengths to keep Epstein's files under wraps? One leading theory is that Jeffrey Epstein may have been an intelligence asset, and exposing the full extent of his activities would implicate not just rich perverts, but the clandestine agencies themselves. This theory, once dismissed as fringe, has gained credibility from multiple sources. Notably, Alexander Acosta, the prosecutor turned Trump labor secretary who brokered Epstein's 2007 plea deal, reportedly explained that he'd been told to back off because Epstein, quote, belonged to intelligence, end quote. In other words, Epstein was supposedly doing work for one or more spy agencies, giving him protection. Acosta's stunning admission, allegedly made to the Trump transition team, implies that Epstein's lenient treatment was no accident, but rather was ordered from above to safeguard a covert operation. While Acosta later attempted to downplay his remarks, the episode raised the obvious question: whose intelligence agency had Epstein on payroll? Let's take a look at what the evidence may suggest. Both Epstein and his confidant, Ghislaine Maxwell, moved in circles tied to both U.S. and Israeli intelligence. Maxwell's late father, Robert Maxwell, was a British media mogul, long rumored to be an operative for Mossad, which is Israel's spy agency. In a recent legal filing, one of Epstein's victims, filing as Jane Doe number 200, swore that Robert Maxwell was in the Mossad, and that she was led to believe by both Maxwell and Epstein that Epstein was as well. According to her complaint, Epstein would even boast about Robert Maxwell's prowess as an exceptional Mossad agent, hint at his own intelligence ties, and brag about connections to powerful figures from presidents to the intelligence community to an infamous arms dealer. Epstein cultivated this mystique of untouchable power, at times explicitly dropping hints that he was working for Mossad, according to the victim's testimony. If true, this means Epstein's entire sex trafficking enterprise might have doubled as a blackmail operation on behalf of a spy agency, recording VIPs and compromising acts for political and financial leverage. This potential Mossad connection has drawn considerable attention. Epstein had an unusually close friendship with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who visited Epstein's Manhattan townhouse dozens of times between 2013 and 2017. Why exactly was a former head of the government meeting so frequently with a disgraced sex offender? Epstein also had ties to prominent Israeli military and intelligence figures through business dealings. It is not a wild conjecture that Mossad could have employed Epstein. After all, sexual blackmail or honey traps are a well-known espionage tactic. In fact, seasoned investigative journalists, including Julie K. Brown, whose work helped bring Epstein to justice, have openly mused about an Israeli intelligence link. Brown noted Epstein's close relationship with Robert Maxwell and said there was a possible connection between Epstein and the Israeli intelligence community. Even one of Epstein's accusers from a 2016 lawsuit alleged she was told that Epstein worked for Mossad. Unsurprisingly, officials in Israel strenuously deny all of this. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett recently dismissed allegations that Epstein ran a Mossad-backed blackmail ring as categorically and totally false, blasting it as a vicious wave of slander against Israel. But Bennett's defensive posture came in response to high-profile figures like Tucker Carlson, explicitly speculating that Epstein was likely working for the Israeli government, and pointing to the taboo around even asking that question. Carlson is not alone. Across the political spectrum, people demanded to know on whose behalf Epstein was working. The fact that the U.S. Department of Justice so adamantly insists no client list or blackmail evidence has been identified only fuels suspicion further. Many find it hard to believe that a man who meticulously filmed his victims and VIP guests, as multiple witnesses have attested, somehow collected zero usable dirt on anyone powerful. More likely, say the cynics, is that such evidence does exist but remains classified. Indeed, Trump's own Attorney General in 2025, Pam Bondi, let slip that the FBI was reviewing tens of thousands of videos related to Epstein, with children or child porn, an alarming claim given that neither Epstein nor Maxwell were ever charged in child pornography possession. Bondi's statement raised the stakes. There are truly tens of thousands of illicit videos. Who and what do they show? Rather than clarify, Bondi's DOJ later insisted no incriminating tapes were found, a contradictory message that left the public even more convinced of a cover. It is entirely plausible that Epstein functioned as a confidential asset for multiple intelligence services, perhaps as part of a joint CIA-Mossad operation, or maybe he was simply tolerated by the CIA because he was supplying valuable information. Remember that Epstein's activities span decades, crossing multiple borders and involving internationally prominent people. Such a sprawling criminal enterprise would almost certainly come onto the radar of intelligence agencies. The FBI, in fact, received reports about Epstein's abuse as early as the 1990s from victims, yet no effective action was taken for years, suggesting Epstein had protectors or patrons high up. If elements of the CIA were involved or benefited from Epstein's blackmail archives, for instance, to pressure foreign dignitaries or U.S. politicians, that would certainly explain the extreme bipartisan reluctance to shine light on the case. Revelations of that sort would rock the foundations of government, showing that the U.S. intelligence officials condoned the sexual abuse of minors as a tool of espionage. It would also enrage allies like Israel if Mossad's role were exposed. Thus, the safest route for all authorities involved is to stonewall, bury the Epstein files, deny any conspiracy, and vilify those who ask questions as conspiracy theorists. This playbook is painfully familiar to students of intelligence history. To fully understand the Epstein cover-up, one must recognize that government misconduct being hidden from the public is nothing new. Especially when intelligence agencies are involved, secrecy and impunity have often trumped truth and accountability. The CIA and other clandestine arms of government have a long, sordid record of heinous stunts, including crimes against American citizens, that were later hushed up or spun away by officials. Consider the following few examples from history, which illustrate a pattern of abuse and cover-up. First, there was MKUltra. In the Cold War era between the years of 1953 and 1973, the CIA ran Project MKUltra, a clandestine human experimentation program that subjected unwitting Americans to mind-altering drugs, electroshock, and other forms of torture in an effort to develop brainwashing techniques. The program was completely illegal and kept secret. Hundreds of citizens were dosed with LSD or other chemicals without consent as the CIA tried to create mind control assassins. When news of MKUltra finally leaked in the 1970s, CIA Director Richard Helms destroyed most of the records to cover up the extent of the crimes. Only fragmentary evidence remained for congressional investigators. No CIA officials were ever prosecuted for the countless lives damaged, and the agency escaped with a slap on the wrist after claiming such experiments would never happen again. Next, there's Operation Chaos, which ran from 1967 to 1974. During the height of the Vietnam War and Civil Rights Movement, the CIA launched a massive domestic spying operation targeting American citizens, codenamed Operation Chaos. Despite the CIA's charter explicitly barring domestic activity, Presidents Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon directed the agency to infiltrate and surveil anti-war protesters, student activists, and Black militants on U.S. soil. The CIA compiled files on thousands of law-abiding Americans, including journalists, academics, and even members of Congress, simply for opposing government policy. This gross violation of civil liberties was kept secret until investigative reporters and the Senate Church Committee exposed it in 1975. The CIA's leadership at the time had flat out lied that they weren't spying on Americans. Once again, no one was held meaningfully accountable. The agency claimed it was under pressure from the White House and quietly shut down Chaos when it became a PR liability. And then we come to the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s. Perhaps one of the most destructive open secrets was the CIA's complicity in the explosion of crack cocaine in American cities. In the 1980s, as part of the Iran-Contra affair, CIA-backed Niagaran Contra rebels were allowed to smuggle cocaine into the United States, profiting off drug sales that devastated communities from Los Angeles all the way to New York. Investigative journalist Gary Webb's groundbreaking Dark Alliance series in 1996 revealed that a CIA-linked drug ring sold cocaine in South Central Los Angeles and funneled millions in profits back to the Contras, effectively fueling the crack epidemic in Black neighborhoods to fund an illegal war. Webb accused the CIA of being complicit in getting thousands of poor African Americans addicted to crack for geopolitical ends. The outrage forced an internal CIA Inspector General inquiry, which admitted in 1998 the CIA had indeed worked with Contra assets despite knowledge of their drug trafficking. Yet the agency insisted it never intended for drugs to flood America's streets, a feeble excuse for one of the most atrocious acts ever perpetrated by U.S. intelligence on its own people. Neither the CIA nor any government officials faced criminal consequences, and the truth was largely buried. And of course, Gary Webb was viciously discredited by establishment media for daring to uncover. Finally, in the 2000s, the CIA was caught spying on the U.S. Senate. Even when the CIA's misdeeds do come to light, the agency often resorts to further misconduct to obstruct justice. A telling case occurred in 2014 when the Senate Intelligence Committee was investigating the CIA's post-9/11 torture and rendition program. CIA Director John Brennan flatly denied that his agency was spying on Senate investigators, only to later concede that, in fact, CIA technicians hacked into Senate computer networks, monitored Senate staff emails, and even purged documents to which the committee was entitled. This brazen act of spying on Congress, the body meant to oversee the CIA, was a blatant constitutional violation. One outraged senator described it as illegal and a breach of separation of powers, calling it grave misconduct and a tremendous failure of leadership at the CIA. And yet, despite evidence that the CIA was trying to cover up its torture crimes by intimidating overseers, no one, again, was prosecuted. Brennan merely apologized and the matter was swept under the rug. The White House at the time, under President Barack Obama, even stood by Brennan despite the scandal. Once again, the intelligence community proved untouchable, shielded from consequences by political friends. Our governmental undercover domestic crime list is by no means exhaustive. We could discuss the FBI's Coin and Tell program against civil rights leaders, or the NSA's warrantless surveillance of Americans, or the lies told about weapons of mass destruction. The pattern, however, remains consistent. When faced with inconvenient truths, government agencies reflexively cover up, deny, or destroy evidence. And politicians of both parties often aid in keeping those secrets. Is it any wonder, then, that the full truth of the Epstein's affair remained hidden? Given Epstein's potential ties to agencies like the CIA and Mossad, the impulse to bury the story fits a well-worn historical template. Protect the institution, protect the powerful, sacrifice transparency and justice in the name of national security or simple self-preservation. The saga of Jeffrey Epstein, from his horrific crimes to his suspicious death, to the ongoing suppression of the case's records, is a stark illustration of the government that does not deem itself accountable to we, the people. Both Democratic and Republican leadership have failed Epstein victims and the public at every turn. They failed to protect the vulnerable when it mattered, failed to fully prosecute all perpetrators, and now fail to level with the American people about what really happened. Instead of transparency, we get theater, partisan finger-pointing, half-hearted document dumps, and convenient assertions that, there's nothing to see here. But the public is not fooled. Each twist in this saga, each time an official blocks the release of files or makes a dubious claim, further erodes trust in our institutions. It sends the message that certain truths are just too explosive to be told, and that justice can be subverted by those with friends in high places. The implications go far beyond Epstein. If an international child sex trafficking ring can be effectively swept under the rug because it entangled VIPs and spies, what exactly does that say about our so-called democracy? It suggests we live under a form of elite impunity, where normal rules don't apply to the well-connected. This is the same impunity that allowed the CIA to poison its own citizens and cover it up, that allowed government agents to deal drugs and jail low-level dealers, and that allowed torturers to escape punishment while their agencies spied on elected officials. Such a government, left unchecked, becomes a law unto itself. Secrecy corrodes democracy. Accountability dies in darkness, and right now the Epstein cover-up is a glaring stain on both the Biden and Trump administrations. Now, an activist might say that the answer is public pressure, loud, relentless demands for the truth. Already, we see unlikely coalitions of left and right demanding that the Epstein files be released. Friends, that pressure must continue. Every document, every video, every photograph in FBI custody related to Epstein should be made public, but of course with appropriate redactions for victim privacy. There is no legitimate reason to keep shielding the names of Epstein's co-collaborators or clientele if no criminal charges are forthcoming. The usual excuse of ongoing investigation no longer applies. The DOJ has, after all, closed the case. All right, so release the files already. Let we the people see what's in them and decide who bears moral culpability. Shine a light on any intelligence ties, be they CIA, Mossad, or otherwise, so that if our security agencies were complicit, they can be held to account in the court of public opinion, if not a court of law. At the end of the day, this is about so much more than Jeffrey Epstein. It's about whether justice in America truly serves the powerless or only the powerful. It's about whether our government operates in good faith or operates like a crime syndicate when it suits them. The ugly history of the CIA and other intelligence bodies shows a recurrent willingness to commit atrocities and then lie to the public about it. The Epstein case tragically fits that mold. Unspeakable crimes, and now an official silence that speaks volumes. We must not let this issue fade into the background. If there is one lesson from all these scandals, it is that sunlight and public scrutiny are the only antidotes to corruption. The victims of Epstein and of every government cover-up deserve nothing less than the full truth. And the American people deserve a government that faces that truth instead of burying it. No more cover-ups. The time for accountability is long overdue. And that, my friends, is the final word up front. My name is Sean Sainhart, and this is Coup Save America. Our guest today is a protector of children and an advocate for social change. Author Lance Hillsinger will be joining us to talk about poverty in America, and he'll be with us right after the break.
Save America. Coup Save America. Podcast you need every week. Work you will do for latest news and understand economy and politics. This is Coup Save America.
My guest today is Lance Hillsinger, who holds a master's degree in psychology from Vanderbilt University and a bachelor's degree in psychology and political science from UCLA. He was a child welfare social worker for 34 years and personally filed over 600 cases with juvenile court. Now, Lance writes books and appears on podcasts and radio shows with twin goals of informing and advocating for change. He's the author of 4 books, 2 of which deal with the effect of poverty on our social structures. In both of these books, Lance fights for various changes to make government-funded safety net programs work better, and I doubt that any of his solutions appear in Trump's big, beautiful bill. Lance, welcome to the program, my friend.
Sean, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I owe you a bit of an apology. We had a bit of a mix-up, and I thought that there was another guest appearing this week. So I was not able to finish your book. I got to chapter 9. So
Okay.
I do apologize for that. But what I've read so far is absolutely fascinating. And I'd like to just kind of start really with a little bit more of your background.
Oh, well, yes, Sean, I was, like you said, a child welfare social worker for 34 years. The first 5 years was in LA County, and then for the balance of that was San Luis Obispo County, which is located just north of Santa Barbara. For most of my career as what was colloquially called a court worker, meaning I handled cases from the beginning of the court case until the child is declared a dependent or the case is dismissed. Sometimes dismissed doesn't mean that it didn't occur, but you may release the child to the non-offending parent, which is usually the father, and dismiss it that way. So the key early part, and in California has a unique system. The social worker files the paperwork with the court to start the court process, reviews that with county council. In most states, however, it's an assistant attorney general that files that. And I very much felt like this was my line of work. This is what I wanted to do. I thoroughly enjoyed it. There were rough days, of course, but I found it very rewarding and very, but also very, very frustrating, especially at the beginning of my career. When I left LA County, I had 77 children in my caseload. And that is just far, far too many children. And the system had a lot of growth pains. And so I started writing my book, In Place of the Parent, Inside Child Protective Services, hopefully to change the system a little bit. And also to educate people, because juvenile court is conducted as private, it's confidential. And so, of course, conspiracy theories can creep in there. And so I wanted to elucidate and talk about what, some of the things that go on with protecting the privacy of the individuals that I dealt with. And just to make clear to those listening that are watching, Child Protective Services does not have authority in Epstein kind of cases.
Right.
That is strictly a law enforcement matter. We deal with abuse that has occurred in the home. Anything that's occurred in an institutional setting, a daycare, a school, a summer camp, that is a law enforcement matter. However, one of the things that has happened during the career is there was a change in the code section that if a child, which is usually a girl, is involved and she's being trafficked, and there's a provision by the code, her parents may not have been abusive to her, but maybe for whatever reason, she can't return to the home. There's now a provision in the California code that says that the court can come step in and get that girl in a safe place, like a foster home, or for some reason she still has issues with her parents or whatever, that she cannot be safely returned. When that modification was made in the law, I tried to find out, a few years later, how many kids, in researching my book, how many kids that's applied to. And I ran into a brick wall, so I understand the brick wall somewhat. But I don't think it's a huge number. I don't get the sense, talking with my coworkers, that it's a large number that come under that statute. The thing that I ask as a social worker, as far as the Epstein thing, and I want to move on to other stuff, is that I don't know how many girls were involved. I haven't followed the case as closely as you have, or closely as a lot of people have. But how many of those girls were reported as missing by their parents? Where were their parents? And that seems to be, to me, an undiscussed issue of it. Of course, there's larger issues than what you've talked about, but that's the one that I kind of say, hey, what was going on with these girls' parents that let them be on this island? So I wonder what was going on there. But that's the only CPS angle on that one. One of the things that, like I said, I handled court cases in California. Unlike some states, most states this is true, but in some states, parents are not allowed. Parents are not appointed legal counsel.
Really?
California, if they're poor enough, they're appointed legal counsel to represent themselves in the juvenile case. But in some states, considered juvenile court a civil proceeding, they're not appointed. They have to represent themselves or hire an attorney. And about 90% of my parents were poor enough to qualify for court-appointed counsel. So the link between the social ill of child abuse, child neglect, and poverty is very high. And that's why I wrote the second book, Build a Better Bridge, Social Policy for the 21st Century. So we have a lot of poverty in this issue that relates to social ills like homelessness. And what can we do about that? What can we do to lift everybody up? And is it throwing money at a problem is not always the solution? What can we do to tweak the regulations to make them more effective? And social workers are kind of accused of being optimists, and we have to be in our line of work. We deal with some very difficult people. You have to be somewhat optimistic that people change, or you're in the wrong occupation. So that's why I wrote those books, to try to make changes in both the welfare system in general and in specifically the child welfare field.
And let's go ahead and bring up the books here too, so we can let our audience know. We've got I'll let my producer do that. Build a Better Bridge, Social Policy for the 21st Century, and your other book, In Place of the Parent, Inside Child Protective Services. And I want to let my audience know that, I want you to actually let them know that you have, you're donating a portion of the proceeds from these books that you sell to an organization in Ukraine, correct?
That's correct. There's a lot of worthy causes in this world. No one can contribute to all of them. But I donate to Razom, which is a approved charity program that does humanity work in Ukraine. And it's just my way of my charity work. And if I can briefly mention my latest book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, A Court Investigator Looks at the Gospels. This is my way of being a Christian, of going out and trying to make the world a better place. There's lots of things to do, but this is where I want to help people. And I see the suffering. There's suffering in Gaza, but that has a lot of world attention. Other places of world attention, you can't save every whale, but this is the whale I'm trying to help save.
Well, thank you so much for doing that. Let me start here. How would you define poverty in the United States today, beyond just income thresholds?
How would I define it?
Yeah,
I think the Census Bureau defines it as X number of dollars.
right.
And it's roughly, it's in the low teens. It bumps up and down with the economy. But, before the war on poverty, it was in the high teens. Now with all the social services programs, you got people that's now in the low teens. One of the things that I found researching the book was that we tend to think of people on food stamps as the poor family or somebody. Not nearly 10% of seniors are on food stamps.
Yeah.
And if you are a poor young adult, you might have a chance to break out of poverty. You may have upward mobility, but if you end your working years poor, the chances are you're going to die poor.
And what is the correlation that you found between poverty and child neglect or child abuse?
Well, neglect is, there's the vast majority, I shouldn't say the most common reason that kids are placed in protective custody is neglect due to drug abuse or substance abuse. And I think that some people, their lives spin out of control and they turn to drugs. They self-medicate by trying to deal with their problems. Why people do illegal drugs is different. There's lots of reasons, but one main reason is that you escape your problems for a moment. You feel good. And if you're poor and you can't make rent and you can't do this, you can't, at least for a moment, and then it can spin out of control because it's a very addictive substance. And one of the things it does is suppress appetite. So a parent may not intentionally say, I'm not going to feed my child, but because you're not feeling hunger yourself, it's harder to remember, oh yes, my child needs to eat, especially a pre-verbal child. One of the things that I point out in the book is that dental care, by far the most common order I requested for medical care was treatment for a young child to have anesthesia so that some deep dental procedure could be accomplished. Like you could take all the other medical procedures that they've asked a judge to approve together, combined, they don't equal that. Because people wouldn't, when they're on drugs, they don't tend to thinking like, oh, I have to help my little child brush their teeth. Now, you could be really harsh. God, what an uncaring parent. You can't even remember to brush your child's teeth. But one of the things I pointed out in San Luis Obispo County, we had only one dental clinic that served the poor for many years. When we had more dental clinics that served the poor, the number of orders that I needed to take the judge dropped by about half. So it's not just the parents' failure to do something, it's also the government's failure to do something. It's both.
Why do you believe that poverty has increased despite decades of so-called government intervention?
Well, I think it has increased from war on poverty. We have many more people than on poor. But just doing some research, we had like 42 million people on food stamps in 2023 and only 20 million in 1990. It's not very politically correct to say, but one of the things is because poor people have more children. The birth rate of women with a high school diploma or less is roughly half that of a woman with a college degree who presumably can be successful economically. And you take that just a matter of compounding. You have one family that has 3 or more children than another family. Those children don't have any mobility, and it's increasing simply because of birth rates. It's not government incompetence. I'm not saying there isn't some government incompetence. It's not because people are lazy, but there are some people lazy. The predominant thing is simply demographics. And why we have so many poor people has multiple causes. And why disproportionately, if you see someone who is truly homeless, under the bridge homeless, it's usually a man. And I think if we started talking about this as a gender inequality issue, I think we might have better solutions. I had an occasion to visit Philadelphia, and I was amazed at seeing men sleep on the streets. I had seen people with help me signs around San Luis Obispo, which is a fairly affluent area, but never someone like just sleeping there on the sidewalk, not not even finding a bridge or some other place with a little more shelter or something. And that it's just appalling. And I think that we can obviously we have to do a better job. It's a moral imperative. It's also, penny wise and pound foolish if we don't do, don't reform our social net. One of the things that I think I try to preach about is people talk about people on welfare, oh, they're cheats and whatever. All they give you. No, by and large, that's people struggling. I talk in the book how this one woman had 800 and some odd dollars in rent, and her cash aid was like $20 more. She had $20 to pay for everything else in the month after paying rent. And that's not an untypical story, especially in a very high rent area like San Luis Obispo. One of the things like we have welfare reform, you have welfare to work, you have to be working, okay, you have to work so many hours, or you can be in school. But typically there's just a 1-year exemption. Well, you can't really get a degree. You can't get an AA degree in 1 year. Or government is penny wise and pound foolish if we don't say, hey, okay, let you have 2-year exemptions. You get an 8A degree or certificates in various trades or whatever, so you can be self-sufficient. And in the long run, that's good. Even though in the short run you're spending more money, but you're going to have that person on the tax rolls instead of their children getting free lunch at school or free medical care, that kind of thing. And the other thing that sort of bugs me is I work with a lot of the fathers report. Like I said, 90% of the caseload were either poor or if they're incarcerated, they're poor because they're in jail or prison. But if you have a situation where a mom, let's say she has 2 children by 2 different men, and she's a single mom, and let's say the father of the first child, he's got a decent job, so she gets child support directly from him. Okay. Say the second father he's not so successful. He works sporadically or works at low-paying jobs. She doesn't. Any child support she gets from him is not goes to her. It goes to offset the government. No, people say, well, that's only fair. The government's giving her, we should get a little from the dad. But the practicality of that is it doesn't have any incentive for the father to be part of mainstream society. If he doesn't see the money going for his kids, why should he be in mainstream economy? He's going to be more inclined to work a cash job because nothing's going for his kids. He's working for Uncle Sam, not for his children. And so we should allow that father who's just struggling by. And then, a lot of people go in and out of employment. And if you've got child support, you wind up with getting behind. You have 10% interest charges. And, a guy, if he's gets way behind, he can lose his driver's license. And so I think if you have this incentive of that, his child support, whatever the allocation is, to go to the mom, not only is the child living a little bit better standard of living, you also have a better relationship with him and the mother because she sees him as supportive. And, it's one of those things where doing the not so obvious thing is actually the better thing. And that is not collect and let the mom recoup that money.
So are you saying that the child support goes to the government, not to the mother?
If you're on welfare, yes. The child support that's collected from the absent father goes to offset the cost, goes to government. But it's such a small amount, I couldn't find it anywhere. You won't find, if you go look at a government chart of where we get our income from, you can find out we got so many millions from Fish and Game and so many millions from this kind of thing and that kind of but you can't find it labeled anywhere. It is such a small amount. So people say, well, no, it won't be missed if the government doesn't take it. So no, it's collected. Now, if the dad has a really good job and it's more than she would get in aid, then it's just regular child support. I'm not saying that she doesn't, she can get, but if she's on aid, any child support collected goes to offset and goes back to the government.
Okay. Can you maybe walk me through the historical trajectory of U.S. welfare programs from, like, say, Lincoln to Biden?
Well, that's a lot of history. I don't want to bore your listeners too much, but you know, in the pre-Revolutionary War, when there were charity hospitals, even before America became independent, we've had charity hospitals. The local city government would fund place for people who couldn't afford their medical care. Then what really kind of took over, then you had poorhouses and almshouses. The distinction being generally that the poorhouses were secular, the almshouses were run by some sort of religious organization. And then you had the Civil War, and then you had many men maimed, or, you know, Lincoln talked about the widow and the orphan, and so government kind of stepped in. So if you were maimed as a private, you got about a third of your pay as what we would call a disability payment these days. And so there was recognition that the government has some responsibility. The first hospitals where the federal government started paying for medical care for Civil War veterans. That's where government's role in medical care started. Then, as in the late 1800s, you had a lot of charities started. Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse. You had Florence Crittenden, the Salvation Army. You had a lot of charities that were offering aid. And some states offered what was called outdoor relief. And that was to distinguish between indoor relief of like a poorhouse or an almshouse. Okay. So outdoor relief was, at first when I saw that term, I thought that meant somebody like homeless or something, but no, it meant that you were not in an institution. And that they would provide some modest amount and to help support the family. Very often, if you look back, there was references, so the family does not have firewood, because that was a critical time. You needed heat, you needed wood for a fire back then. Then in the early 1900s, states started having developed their own welfare programs. You had aid to dependents with children, and there was a wide variety in the states. And then eventually the federal government got involved in like the 30s and said, okay, to certain dollar limits, we're going to pay for 2/3 of the cost of aid, and the states will pay for 1/3. And that was AIDS dependent children, and that morphed into AIDS to families with dependent children, and then now has morphed into TANF, temporary aid to needy families. And the rules became more specialized, more stringent. Child support was required, to collection from the absent father was required. Work requirements were had. And so that has been the evolution. And, you know, this has kept the numbers of people who are desperately poor, you know, the number of people who just die from malnutrition or something like that, down to near zero. But it's still a lot of number of people, and the absolute numbers are growing. The percentage has dropped, but the absolute numbers, and for each, you know, and I don't mean to sound callous, but for each acre that you devote to public housing, that's an acre you've taken out of the private market, as far as for developing housing, the private sector. So what is it? There's a tension there between assistance and then just letting regular people get ahead too. There's a shortage of daycare. There's a shortage of affordable housing, not for the poor, for, you know. Yeah, just for middle class folks. You know, and especially in like San Luis Obispo, it's the price of homes has gone astronomical. One of the things I point out in the book is Levittown, which was formed after World War II. You know, men would with the GI Bill bought homes, and they built up equity in those homes. But over time, the value of homes and equity has exceeded inflation by about 5 times. So in other words, the home value has gone 5 times as fast as the rate of inflation. Of course, most veterans of World War II have died. They passed their equity on their children, who, you know, whether their children were good people or not good people, or, you know, they didn't earn that by any kind of military service. And I'm not saying to turn away inheritance laws, but the fact of the matter is those children of those veterans got equity that someone else didn't get. And that gets to be passed on. And home ownership is the way that was a cushion for people to build, to allow the next generation to succeed. And here in San Luis Obispo, is like many places in the country, the percentage of home ownership is dropping consistently because the families are priced out of it. You have corporations buying housing. Yeah. not mentioned in the book, but I've mentioned in other podcasts that have come up with is if you're not an owner-occupied house, if you're a corporation buying a home and you're going to rent it on the market, there should be a penalty for that, for pricing a homeowner out. You know, we say to a developer, you're going to build a house, you have to build so much in developer fees. So this is the same kind of thing. Okay, you corporation, you're pricing somebody out of a house, you have to pay an extra 5% or on the house, and they'll go into a fund to provide for public housing in some way, form, or another. Something like only a third of homeowners in San Luis Obispo are people who own their own home, are living in their home that they own. The rest are renters. And that's a tremendous change because that doesn't allow the next generation to inherit.
Well, and the economy has changed quite dramatically as well. A lot of the good paying jobs that were available to previous generations simply do not exist anymore.
Yeah, it bumps up and down, but roughly from, say, compared to 1990, there's roughly 2/3 of the number of factory jobs. It goes up and down a little bit, but roughly 2/3. And these were jobs mainly held by men, where they could you could have a decent wage and decent earnings, and you didn't have to have a college degree, but you could afford a home. I mean, not something lavish, but you had a place and that your kids could get, and so on. And yes, and automation has kept prices down, but there's also a social cost. As I point out, the San Luis Obispo were very dependent on two things: agriculture and tourism. And like many cities, we have a municipal parking garage, and there used to be parking attendants who would take your parking fee, but now we went to an automated system.
Yep.
I'm sure it saves the city money, but now you could have been the hardest working, friendliest parking lot attendant, but you're out of a job now because the computer's taken over. And where does that person go? What do they do? How do they support? How do they have health care? And we're going that way, that's going to be displacing jobs that were used to be held by people. Travel agents is another thing. Most people make our own travel arrangements now. We go on whatever website we like and we say, okay, this is where I'm going to fly. But back when I grew up, travel agents stood up and they got a commission. They're mostly women who did that job, and they got a commission for that, and that's how they lived, and that's displacing that. And we have that a lot, and so we have more and more demands, or more people struggling to make ends meet, whether Republicans in office or Democrats in office. That has been a trend for years now. And I offer a few ideas. I don't say that it's a complete list of ideas to help people be successful. One thing I do concentrate on is that high school graduation, which used to, that's like mandatory these days. Most people need some training, some not necessarily college, but some technical school of some form or another, trade school, to get ahead to find a decent job. But the girl who fails to graduate high school, she's more likely to get pregnant and go on social services. She's an economic drag on society. But the boy who fails to graduate, he's more likely to not only father a child that he cannot afford to support, but he's more likely to drop into criminal activity. His failure to graduate is a matter of public safety. And so one of the things I'm emphasizing is that we need to pay attention to that boys fail to graduate high school at a much higher rate than girls, particularly children of minority children. Black and Hispanic boys don't graduate at nearly the rate as white girls, and we need to address that. And one of the things, very simple, I respect people who say, "Hey, I don't want to throw money at a problem," so I try to find out solutions that don't throw money at a problem. And I say, okay, let's have school districts who get federal money, which is basically everyone, be required to post their graduation rates broken down by gender. One of the axioms in social work is you can't solve a problem until you identify a problem. So if you said, hey, we're going to force you to say, why you have 30 boys not graduate and only 6 girls, or something like that, and public attention. When I served briefly, well, not briefly, over a year, on the School Attendance Review Board, So when somebody's truant or chronically truant, the child and the parent come before the school board. 3/4 of the time, 2/3 to 3/4 of the time, it was a boy who wasn't going to school for whatever reason. And there's no one single pattern in that, but whatever the pattern is if that child, the boy doesn't graduate school, that girl doesn't graduate, that's going to cost the taxpayers one form or another.
Why do you think it is that boys are dropping out at higher rates than girls?
Well, I don't say it's the cause, but I think it's one cause is how we teach English.
Right.
English, typically you need 4 years of English to graduate high school. What do we typically teach in English classes? Fiction. One of the things I've learned as an author is that fiction books are much more popular than nonfiction. People want escapism. They don't want, generally they want a little escapism. They don't want to read more facts and figures and whatever. But 80% of those fiction books are bought by women. So, of course, there's exceptions, but boys just don't take to fiction, and yet we require boys to have 4 years of boys and girls to have 4 years of fiction, and typically in high school. And we should teach at least one of those years should be nonfiction. How do you write a report about such and such? How do you write this? Something that they would have not only for useful as an adult, if you had to write a report at work for some reason, or a sales report, or an accident report, or something like that, and that you've polished those skills to write nonfiction clearly.
Yeah.
And that.
Oh, go ahead.
That's just one of those things. Again, it's a cheap thing. It doesn't cost anything, and yet may have consequences that will prove beneficial. I don't have all the answers to that, but that is one answer, I think.
Yeah, when I read that, I thought that was very interesting, that correlation between fiction and nonfiction, and the impact that it would have on job preparedness, especially.
Yeah.
And I never even knew that schools didn't publish gender-specific graduation data.
Some
Why
do.
does that transparency matter?
Why does it matter?
Yeah, why would you? What argument would you make to people to push for that?
Well, again, you have to identify a problem before you can treat it, and I think that that's something that just isn't out there. As if you ask people, they would just assume that the failure to graduate was pretty much even.
Yeah.
And so I think that just highlighting that is just one of those things that it's not a common statistic out there, and you have to let people know that that's an issue. And then each school district may, a solution in Louisiana might be a different solution than in Montana, but that's at least you're getting people alerted to the problem. One of the other things I pointed out in California now, every child qualifies for free lunch. That's been relatively new. And one of the things that I think caused boys to drop out and poor kids in general to drop out is because they were socially isolated. It was popular to eat lunch, bring your lunch, or buy lunch at school. But if you're poor, you have to eat in the cafeteria. You're isolated. You're stigmatized. Oh, you're one of the cafeteria kids. So to be cool, you either, you might just skip lunch. And a lot of teenagers skip breakfast. So you had a kid who's hungry in school. It's going to be a little irritable and more hard for the teacher to manage. Again, yes, it costs money to give everybody free lunch, but you may have a better student at the end of the day, and you don't have the stigma of, oh, you're a cafeteria kid or you're not a cafeteria kid, that kind of thing. So,
in your book, you write, a strong body of research shows that starting the school day later helps students to do better both academically and behaviorally. Why are we not implementing a solution like that?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of your question. I'm sorry.
Well, I was quoting from your book where you say a strong body of research shows that starting the school day later helps students do better both academically and behaviorally.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Kids, especially teenagers, they like to sleep, stay up late, whether it's watching video games or just talking to their friends or both, and then you say, okay, you got to be at school at 8 o'clock. That doesn't work, And so there is some there's a lot of research, and that's why California has shifted to starting school years. I don't remember the exact times offhand. To I think 8:30 to 8. So they've shifted it about a half hour later. And that I think is great. I mean, that by itself is a change that doesn't cost anything. And it's much easier for working parents. If you've got to get your kid, that's better all the way around. And it's you have a better rested student, and you're not working an uphill battle with the kid who stayed up all night, whether it's writing a report or staying on Facebook or Instagram. You still have a more rested student. And I think that's something that other states should adopt.
I've also read elsewhere that even reducing homework can have a huge impact on academic performance.
Yeah, there's a lot. I'm not an expert in education codes, but I've heard, or education policies, but I've heard that some countries have decreased homework. I remember, my youngest child had a 4.3 because she had to take advanced placement classes, and how hard she studied until late at night. And then, yes, trying to get her to get up in the morning, get her to school was a real struggle. I don't know how far you take that. Like anything else, it's to be moderation. The world's a very competitive place. And I'll point, not to boast about my child, but she had a 4.3 GPA, and she was 36th in her class. That used to be in the old days, valedictorian, but she was like 36th. And so I don't know how you solve this, reducing these things and still keep the competitive, that's a conundrum there. But I do think that there is a lot of pressure on kids, that high school is much more serious. And it tends to be, I think, more extreme. Kids who just shine it on. I don't care. Maybe I'll go to school today. Maybe I won't. And then you have these over teachers that work all night to make sure that they pass their AP classes. And I think there's a greater dichotomy. That's just my perception. I don't have any statistics to show that, but that's my perception. And I think that's bad for society.
Great.
Just more. Speaking of school, just one of the interesting things is that in here in San Luis Obispo and in many other places, the parents have to pay for the school bus. It's not a free. In many districts, that's just provided by the school just for free. But here, the parents have to pay, unless if they're on assistance. If they're on aid, then obviously you don't take government money to pay another government agency. That makes sense. But how many kids? If there's, say, 30 kids on a school bus, and one kid's on aid, okay, I don't mind supporting that one child. But what if half the school bus, that gets to be a burden on me, and I could resent that. At some point, where does it go from, okay, I want to help somebody out, to resenting supporting somebody else? And so that's a very difficult thing. So I think that another thing should be school bus should be free. And they've eliminated the school bus in my local area for high school students. And yet the public housing is on the other side of town. And the high school students, especially the girls that have to walk that distance at times when it's dark, that's going to be one reason why somebody's not going to go to school, or catch a ride with somebody they shouldn't catch a ride with, or something like that. So those kinds of things. If you start the school day later, then kids are walking to school during the daytime and coming home in daytime.
Yeah. In your view, what was the original intent of the war on poverty, and where do you think it went wrong?
Well, I like to think the war on poverty was based on a genuine interest of helping people succeed and lifting everyone up. I think that Johnson was probably concerned also about the black vote and wanted to win that vote. There's a political angle there too. I don't know that it necessarily went wrong. Maybe it wasn't fast enough to the various regulation changes that have occurred. In other words, would we be better off if TANF had occurred 10 years earlier than it did? I think that we would see better outcomes then. And then one of the things, again, about food stamps, this kind of goes back to graduation in high school. Food stamps is calculated like it's always been: size of the family and household income. Well, teenage boys, surprise, surprise, they eat a lot, right? So the budget for a senior, couple of seniors, is the same for a single mom with a teenage boy. You need to have food stamps allocated, age adjusted. So if there's teenagers in the home, there's some sort of supplement. Now, people say that's going to cost money. Yes, it will cost a little bit, but you're going to save a problem because you're going to have a kid who's not hungry at the end of the month. You're going to have a kid who's better behaved in school. So the payoff will be, 5, 10 times. It's hard to calculate what that payoff is, but there definitely would be.
Yeah, I agree. I happen to believe that the American safety net is currently broken. Would you say that as well, or do you think it's just merely outdated?
I think it's, I wouldn't say broken, because I think that there's many times that people have gotten success and help and assistance. I've seen people get into public housing. I've seen people turn their lives around. I've seen people very grateful for their food stamps and positive things about that. I think that partly it's just overwhelming. Partly I think it's a lot of attitude that people give to that. Are there lazy people out there? Of course, those conservatives, but I don't think it's nearly as bad as people say that it is. And do we have as the opportunities? I think part of it is more of the lack of good jobs, and not so much the system itself is broken. It's the economic environment is more challenging now. In one area that we have an area is Creston. It's a very rural area here. If you want a job, you've got to be farming. There's not a choice. There's that or no, that's a very rural area because there's no public bus service. That kind of thing is difficult. And I think that other countries invest more in infrastructure, invest more that have bus service and train service and things like that make it easier for people to get to work. And I know that that's like a bugaboo. Oh, it's going to be expensive. But in the long run, I think you're going to find not only the environment better, but you're going to find people more able to get to work. Opportunities. And then again, what do you have kind of jobs are? The types of jobs out there that pay the stable amount of jobs. So if you take law enforcement and firefighting, predominantly male jobs, okay, and you take nursing and teaching, predominantly female jobs, it's about an 8-to-1 in favor of the women. Those are 2 jobs. Those are 4 job classifications that have good stability, a recession-proof, layoff-proof generally, and you don't have as many of those jobs for men. There are many men now. The percentage of men in nursing is increasing.
Oh, yeah.
It's increasing in part because maybe they want to care for people, but it's also job stability. And the guy who works at construction, he may make real good money when he works as a backhoe operator or whatever, heavy equipment operator. But if it rains, he's not working. A lot of places don't work in the winter or whatever. Or, there's only so many houses that are going to be built that's going to need a backhoe operator in his area. And and his lifespan in that job is shorter than, say, not that they aren't hard. My daughter's a teacher; she works hard, but she will have a longer lifespan in that job than somebody who's laying bricks.
Yeah, absolutely. What metrics do you think we should use to measure the success of anti-poverty efforts?
Well, I think the government does compile all sorts of statistics. Many of the statistics I've cited today and that I cited in the book are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the poverty level. What percentage of Americans are on food stamps? What percentage are living below the poverty level? Those are standards that are made, and the poverty level is adjusted. It's a little bit different in Alaska than it is in Kansas, and so those are both metrics out there already. But I also think you should also look at more global things like percentage of home ownership, more of them, also the middle class jobs. And you ask people, they do happiness surveys and things like that. And, the United States does not rank very high in the happiness index. Other countries are ranked, their citizens rank themselves happier. And we need to do that. And in fact, one of the things, I happened to read a book about German politics, and Germany invests a lot of money in the federal government, in what we would be the equivalent of Parks and Recs department. So they see that this, by investing money in those kinds of things, makes for a better society.
Yeah.
You know, it makes it's good. I had pickleball, gotten into pickleball lately. I had to pay a fair amount to take pickleball lessons at my local Parks and Rec. More people, if that was free and funded by, you'd have people. And yet you're saying, okay, why are we paying for pickleball? Well, you're going to get elderly people out exercising more. They're going to lead healthier lives. You're going to lead happier lives. You're going to get the payoff here. That kind of thing, we should do more, and investments. And then, you know, that I don't want to go on to just Trump, but the national parks have just been decimated, and like that's a place where people could go for a fairly modest amount of money. You get relief from the society, and you can go out and look at the mountains or the river or whatever it is, and you get away from it all, and that's healthy. In fact, in Japan, that's a very common thing, to ask people to go out to nature to get to deal with to resettle themselves. And the number of kids who get that opportunity is declining. I mean, when I was a kid, Boy Scouts were very popular, YMCA camps, that's not. They're a lot of times the families are priced out. If you've had programs where this would be a subsidy, things like that, and it's all sort of charity. We had various charity programs that would sponsor through the courts. CASA would sponsor kids' scholarships, but that's one city would, maybe 5% of the kids get something, another city gets 25%. We shouldn't be dependent upon where you live, whether your kid gets to go to a camp or not.
Yeah. Well, that brings me to are the current school systems reinforcing economic inequality more than they are alleviating it?
I think the vast majority of teachers that I worked with are, of course, like I said, I mentioned both my daughters are teachers, so I'm a little biased there. I think that they work very hard, but what they have to work on sort of very stringent rules. Their lessons plan have to be, there's far more detail. My mother was a teacher. I think she would bridle under the rules that teachers have to follow now, the accountability. And people say, oh, isn't accountability a good thing? Well, you can take it only so far. Like, if you probably enjoy barbecuing, but if I had to tell you, you have to check your burgers every 3 minutes for their temperature, it would take a little bit of the joy out of barbecuing, right? So I think if you ask so much accountability, it takes the joy out of teaching or any civil service position or any business, any position. And so you can tell a little bit of that is too much. And so I think there's also that. I think the most are concerned. I think that there been a change, as I detail in my first book, a couple instances where there was clear racism. I think it's an exception, but it was a powerful exception for kids in my caseload that I felt I had to write about it. Those occurred now over 2 decades ago. So I think the relationship between schools and child welfare, at least locally, has improved, where we consider that more collaborative than it was in past. And but I'm not going to say that in every instance in the CPS and child welfare work well with the school districts. Many times they do. I'm sure the times there's not. And school districts have an agenda for good attendance, which we want to, and to be successful. But I don't think. One of the things I saw on one of the shows, somebody else's show, I think it was, about how, poor districts get less money. No, under equal protection laws in California, each school district is allocated so many dollars per student, and that each school district has to get that amount. If that school district has some special need, like they have an extra large number of English as second language or handicapped students, they get an extra allotment on top of that base allotment. but the base allotment is the same throughout the state. Of course, the poorest, some school districts like LA County, they're going to have a lot more English second language students, and they're going to get more allotment. They're going to per student, they're going to get more because they have more needs, students with more needs, of course. So the money flows is relatively close. And again, one of my, where I grew up in Manhattan Beach, it was upper middle class area. It's gone to a very affluent area now. They pay property taxes on a $2 million home, 10 mills away, and then, in Carson or Compton, 500 homes go for $500,000, $600,000. So you have maybe four times difference in property tax rate, depending upon the end, so there's lots of money there. So there's the other argument here that maybe there's money flowing to the needs as opposed to where in other countries. When I was going to school, there was programs for the gifted children. Those programs have completely disappeared. They are just this very, very, but back when I was in school, there were programs, and maybe in society, we need to fund more so that an American invents the next Blu-ray player or whatever it is. But, that sounds a little elitist, but in the sense that it's maybe good public policy. Because we need to be a leader in the country, because that helps everybody. So I don't think there's any evil intent there. I think the schools operate on some rules and regulations and a little more bureaucratic than they need to be. And teaching is very demanding. My niece is also a teacher, but the students are more difficult. I went into my daughter's class when she was in high school to do a little presentation about social work to the administration, and I couldn't believe how rude the kids were. So it is a challenging job, and so I don't think it's always on the school district or the teacher. There's the kids are not as polite as they were in my generation.
Yeah. And teachers are not getting paid anywhere near what they should be getting paid either.
Yeah. That's my bugaboo about this big, beautiful bill, that overtime is not taxed and tips are not taxed. Well, why should a waitress making $45,000 a year pay less tax than a teacher making $45,000 a year? And that discourages people from going into teaching. It just does. They got paid bills to pay like everybody else.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to the crisis of boys and ask you, what reforms do you think could help schools better engage with low-income boys? Well, again,
I think the two main things is published on the website. The graduation rates have at least 1 year of nonfiction required of English. And I think that one of the things that we have they said, well, in order to play sports, you have to have a C average. And that sounds, from the grown-up viewpoint, that sounds great. Okay, playing sports would be a privilege. Your emphasis should be on, your academics.
Right.
What happened in practice is those kids who were CD students, generally, they weren't motivated to go to academics. They said, well, if I can't play basketball, that's the only reason I went to school and sat in my English class. And so why go at all then? And so why that sounds so well-meaning, I think that in practice, it's not enforced, and they recognize that it's not. And so it's good to have it on the books because you want to encourage kids, but sometimes people see it through as a hollow threat. The kids start to eventually see it as a hollow threat. But yet it keeps kids in classrooms and that. So I don't have any specific to make it more exciting for boys to graduate. There's no secret sauce there. I think that, again, I said that solutions have to be for each school district. I do think that, while sports are important, music is also another thing. Kids who play that, you have to learn that team. Big thing in corporate rollers now is teamwork and working in teams and blah, blah. Well, playing in a concert is even more of a teamwork. If you're in football and you miss your block, your team may still score a touchdown. If you're in a concert and you miss the opening note or whatever, the song's not as good. And so that's very important. And I think that we could do that by funding music, and the kids have the pride of that. And a kid who maybe struggles a little bit academically, if they get music, and yet, music instruments are expensive, and if you're looking at trimming the budget, it's something, do I pay a teacher? Do I give teachers 5% raise and not buy musical instruments this year, or do I give a 3% raise from school district? And it's a struggle. And of course, the more money you have, the easier it is to meet your struggles, whether you're a school district administrator or a parent.
Talk a lot in your book too about the gender imbalance that exists in both college and professional schools, and how that affects the broader economy. And I wonder if you can kind of extrapolate on that for our audience.
Well, one of the things I noticed in social work and the fathers in my caseload is, by and large, they were less educated. They were less likely to have a high school degree. The women in my caseload, the mothers, were more, not by a lot. Usually people were of similar education, but the difference was a little bit in favor of the women, whatever economic, in general. There's, of course, exceptions. I also think that, professional schools are at the elite schools, as I've been in the research, is that there's about 50-50 men, women. But as you go to second tier schools, there's a great discrepancy. And in vet schools, veterinary schools are like 3/4 female now. I have a friend of mine, he's an older veterinarian. He wants to take over his practice, but he says he can't find anybody, man or woman, to take over his practice, because there's not enough people. But there's not, and I think that is, you have a lot of, you have these take your child to women, or take your daughter work days. I think you have a thing where dads are left out here if mom's the doctor, and since the majority, especially in mental health, let me talk about mental health in particular, percentage of women in becoming psychologists has been increasing. Has been the majority since roughly about 2012. And the same with licensed clinical social worker. That's even more greater gender imbalance. So if you have a man who's struggling with some mental health issues, some issue, depression or whatever, he's probably going to be more comfortable going to a male therapist, as women probably would be more comfortable going to female therapists. They're going to feel a kinship there, more likely. There are, of course, plenty of exceptions, but that's an issue there. And I think that especially if you have a dynamic where the woman's in a steady paying job, like teaching or nursing, and the man sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. One of my coworkers, she was a supervisor. She had a good job, but her husband was a chef, and sometimes he worked shifts, and there was the demand of that job and working, and it was not his health insurance that they were using, that kind of thing. And I think that it's hard on, I don't want to. I think you find it hard, and just let's reverse it a little bit. In my growing up, my pediatrician, his wife was his nurse. That was not uncommon. That was very common back then. How many marriages would be successful if the woman was the doctor and the man was the nurse? Where does that put the man in society? That's a struggle. Some people could handle that. I'm not saying they couldn't, but it would be very unusual. That would put a strain on things. I talked with one guy who was one podcast I heard. His wife had a more lucrative career than he did, and it was very clear that was an issue for him, even though he had a professional career. It just wasn't as lucrative, and he did get an opportunity to be more involved as a dad because of that, because his worked part-time, but it wasn't as lucrative, and that's an issue. And you could see he was a little sensitive about that. And marriages are built in partnership, and if there's any kind of inequality, income inequality, that's an issue for guys more than I think the reverse. Men take pride in their work. Not that women don't. Of course, everybody wants to take pride in their work, but women will often tend to have greater social networks. the suicide rate for men is much higher for women. And because they are more socialized, in a cut short is women will do lunch. I can count on probably two hands the number of times I've just had lunch with the guy friend, in the past couple of years, right? It's just a different culture there. And that could lead to loneliness. It can lead to depression and so all sorts of socials ultimately, like I said, especially for older men. If there's a divorce, the children generally go with the mother. The mother will usually stay closer to her mother. So the grandmothers are generally more involved with the children than the absent of the father of the divorce, and that's the loneliness, and that's a factor there. We got to talk about these things. I don't have any grand solutions, but again, if you don't identify the issue, you can't have a solution to it. And that's partly what I wanted to is just magnify this, because I don't think people realize that for every 7 men in college, there's 11. And that there's a lot of attention to this disparity in women in STEM classes. That's true. That's still true. That disparity is declining. But if you flip it, there are fewer men who are becoming teachers. The percentage of men and high school teachers is steadily on the decline. Percentage of men on like English and French college majors and that kind of thing, they're in a minority. So I think that you have to be a little more equity here on how we talk about this. And ultimately, this will have an effect about how many people are homeless, how many people are, if we did away with social net, we would have beggars like on the street, which is occasional now where I live, which is an affluent area. There's places in California where homelessness is just like blocks of it.
Yeah.
And the Republicans love to say, "Oh, look how it's failed state," and there's a grain of truth in that. Yes, you see all these camps, but what are we doing? Are we? And when somebody gets that homeless, it's very expensive to pull somebody all the way out. It's the preventive thing. It's much better to have that job. And so I understand that. Well, okay, we're going to have jobs in America. That's very important. But we have to work on, what's realistic as far as our jobs and our social network. How can we tweak the system, make it a little more kind, a little more successful, and a little more heart.
Yeah, more heart is definitely needed. There's no question there. I want to ask you, what are the long-term, as a social worker, what are the long-term consequences for children that are growing up in a single-parent household? Well,
there are many kids who have grown up in single-parent households that have been very successful, but statistically, the two-parent family is more successful. And it can be the two-adult family, because I've seen situations where it's been like adult mother, and then her mother. There was a couple of foster homes that were like that foster homes were like blocks or near each other, very near each other, and they were the two-parent kind of combination, that kind of thing. But, I think it's a struggle there, and especially for the single dad, who's there. If you remember, there used to be that show, Courtship of Eddie's Father, back in the 70s, the TV show about the struggles of being a single parent. But in that situation, he was a single parent, not because of divorce, but because his wife had died of cancer. That was the backstory. But anyways, because it's harder for him to make the social network to like trade. Hey, can you watch the kids? Can I watch your kids? While you go to the store, you watch mine. While I go to the store and go to the doctor appointment, whatever it is. So that's harder. And just the practicalities is so often like getting your kids to practice and getting the groceries and that kind of thing. And there's just logistical things there. My wife and we had 2 kids, and it was often, okay, it's a lot easier. Okay, you're going to do this chore around the house and you will take the kids where they need to be. If you're a single parent, it's very demanding, and it's harder to find the time to, teach kids morality. I'm not saying it can't be happening, but it's a struggle, and let's not be around that. But Kids need moral teaching. Very few, one of the things I observed and I talk about in my latest book, is that very, very few of my clients had any connection to organized religion. And yet we all need to have some moral foundation. And if it comes just from your mom, that's hard. If it comes from your mom, your dad, and your clergy, well, that's good. There's a synergistic effect there, where a kid has a belief in a God and a goodness and a belief in a better world and responsibilities and things like that. That's great. And the fewer adults that you have in the child's life that are providing some sort of indirect moral instruction, that's harder. And it's harder for that child to develop a well-balanced viewpoint. We're not just our parents, but we're a product of all our experiences. And some people can be turned off. I mean, if you drag a kid to church and you listen to this minister, that's going to be counterproductive. So we need that. And I think we tend to equate immorality with some sort of sexuality or something, but that's also, immorality is charging an obscene amount for drug prices or cheating your employees or that kind of immorality too. And I want to think that most people really are decent. I'm an optimist. I've only really seen a few selection of really the Epsteins in the world. They are the exceptions. Most of the people in my caseload, even though they had troubles, I saw them as human beings, or I like to say, I'll say all of them as human beings, but they were still people of worth if given an opportunity and given their own motivation. Some of it has to be on them too. You have to want to help. But one of the things that I talk about in the first book is we would supervise visits. If a parent had a child in foster care, we would take the young child to jail and have a face-to-face visit inside a holding cell, a very large holding cell. And this parent would get a visit with their child and get to hug their child. If you've had a visit with your child in jail, that's about as low point as you can be, and you can only go up from there. And yet I found many of the men and no other women, they're very powerful, but for the men, this is okay. I need to change my life. Sometimes the women were already there, but the fathers did it. Not everybody, I'm not going to say every case was successful, but that was a very powerful moment. And you would do that. That I don't think is a common policy, to have what we call contact visits. That was only for really young kids. If the older kids, they would have visits for the class, like you would any other inmate. But at least they had private time, But those little changes that don't cost the government anything can result in lots of positive outcomes here. One of the things I just want to share, something that we did in San Luis Obispo, for people on parole. You got on parole, you were required to go to a meeting. And all the parolees, like for that month, would sit in the front row of a conference room. And there would be a presentation, blah, blah, blah. And then at one point, they would tell the parolees to stand up and look behind them. And behind them was every kind of representative from every kind of agency, to say mental health or probation, or not probation because promote, but housing, VA, everything, any kind of social agency that you could think of, government and non-government. We're here to help you be successful. And I have to think that little moment that didn't cost anything probably helped a lot of people succeed. And that's what we need. We need that human contact to help people succeed. We don't get better because somebody cared. And I was at a privilege of working with lots of people. And of course, not every case had a successful outcome, but I think that enough were to where it was a satisfying work. And people did. So this system was working for them. The safety net, yes. Food stamps, that's a lifesaver for a lot of people. They have incidentally, and there's been a lot of thing about, fraud or whatever in the food stamp system. That's mostly like criminal fraud as opposed to the individual client fraud. Person goes in now food stamps are allocated throughout the month. It used to be like the first of the month, everybody got their food stamps. And then people like at midnight or just an hour before midnight, people would go to the Costco's and the Food for Lesses, and maybe not the Costco's, you kind of remember, and be in line so they could check out right at midnight when the money showed up in the government. So no longer we have that, because now the government says, okay, we're going to roll the allocation through the month. So, your birthday's this time, you're going to get your allocation on the 1st. Sort of like Social Security checks. They don't all come on the 1st anymore. They're spread out now through the year, which makes for a more efficient government.
Interesting. Okay. I got to ask you, just out of curiosity, based on your 34 plus years in child welfare, what systemic failures stand out the most to you?
Well, again, being a social worker, I like to send, we tend to say, what's the positive, what's going well first. That's our natural inclination, what's working well. And you kind of praise that, or you acknowledge that first. So let me do that first. The system is much improved from the beginning. The laws are a little bit clarified in various ways. Their procedures are clarified about who could be approved as there's a preference for relatives. Of course, that makes sense. But who's a relative? Is it this mom's best friend from high school, or is it the grandmother great grandmother who's never seen the child? Those rules have been clarified there, and they're very common sense rules. And I think most would look at it. So I want to stress that there's been improvements. I think that where it has backtracked a little bit is there was more and more computer time. I was in front of a computer screen far, as my career progressed, far more than I was the FaceTime with clients. And the bureaucratic level has increased tremendously. And some of it is silly. Some of it is just downright busy work. And that is two things. One, it's a waste of the social worker's time, but it also is bad for morale. You think, did I go to college to fill out this form? And I think that one of the things I wanted to accomplish with the book is to decrease the amount of paperwork. Like I said, with teachers, if you say you have to have extraordinary level of accountability, you take the joy out of it, you take the pride out of it, you take it, and you're just going through the motions. And so you don't want to do that. You want people to value their job and have pride in it. And of course, you have to have accountability. But if you take it to such an nth degree and you have them complete busy work, they're going to look forward to when the call comes in at 4:59. Are they going to leave for work, or are they going to stay and listen to whatever that person calling?
What's causing the decline in family-run childcare providers?
Causing decline in what? I'm sorry.
Family-run childcare providers.
Well, I think that you mean family care daycare providers?
Correct.
Okay. Well, I think more women are wanting careers, and so the number of daycare providers has decreased by about a third in the last 20 years or so. Well, supply and demand. If you have less of something, the price goes up. And one of the solutions I have for that is that, well, why don't we have there's various programs, there's tax incentives and things like that, but that doesn't do anything for supply. You can get a tax credit if your child are in daycare, or if you're poor, you might get a voucher for daycare, but that none of these things increase the supply. So what I propose is that the first, say, $20,000 that a daycare provider earns is tax-free, and that will make daycare more available. More people, more women generally will choose to do maybe something that they like to do, like daycare, than in some sort of office job that they don't really care about, but is lucrative enough for their bills, and they do something that is lucrative enough for their situation, and yet something that they enjoy doing more. If you have more, there's sort of a salutary effect of that. If you have more daycare providers, people are going to get worked more on time more because their commutes are cut down. Because their commutes are cut down, you're going to have less pollution. So there's a lot of salutary effects. So unlike the not taxing tips, which only helps those people who get tips, this will help everyone, even those people who don't have childcare. The employer will be satisfied because the employee is showing up more working because parent doesn't have to drive, 30 miles or 50 miles or whatever. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but for childcare.
Do you believe that child care should be publicly funded as a universal service?
Well, you have this dichotomy here. If you're poor, you could get into Head Start if there's a vacancy. That's the problem is that I had in my case, they applied 6-9 months ahead for Head Start. Okay, the child will be of such and such an age. 6 months from now, we're going to put our application in. Now that's ridiculous because it's like very hard to plan ahead that far ahead. So we already have that for the poor people if there's enough Head Start. For really rich people, no, I don't think they should get it. But for the middle class, childcare, like one of the things I pointed out when my kids were in childcare, now they're adults as other teachers, is I turned to my wife and I said, "Look, honey, there was an ad on TV. You can lease a BMW for $450 a month." And I turned to my wife, "Hey, we could lease 2 BMWs for the price we're paying for childcare."
Yeah.
How much? And I don't think that people who don't have kids childcare age realize how expensive it is. And the tax credits help, but it's nowhere near enough to offset it. So I think that maybe the tax credits need to be increased so it's not just the poor people getting free, and so middle class can get a little more. And again, people say, "Oh, that's going to cost the government money." In the long run, it won't, because you're just going to get people who will be you more easily could have a 2-income family then, and then you're going to have higher tax base. So most of it's going to be offset. And again, there's the salutary effects. If there's more daycare slots, there's less commuting, there's less pollution, there's those secondary effects. So I would not all universal, but make it much more financially where the middle class person can afford it.
I'm a big fan of the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland. It's stunning to me that the United States of America is the only developed nation that doesn't have something like universal health care, paid family leave, and these things pull quite well, bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans alike on these policies, and yet we don't seem to have them. And I'm curious if you have an opinion as to why are American social safety nets so often demonized in our political rhetoric?
Well, I think, those countries, those Scandinavian countries that have socialism, which is a dirty word in much of American political discourse, they have high tax rates, and no politician is going to get elected saying, "I'm going to raise your taxes, but you're going to get these benefits." They don't say it doesn't wash. And so I think that's, and this goes back to like my bugaboo about bond issues. You'll see these bond issues that people will vote for them, and there's huge things. They're huge bond issues, but I wish there would be more specific. Like, okay, we're going to have this tiny issue so the school can get new musical instruments. We're going to have a tiny bond issue so we get new science equipment, and so it's very specific. I'd be much more willing to vote for that, and I usually do vote for it anyways. But where I knew exactly where it was going for. Now there's accounting for it, but there's somehow lost in all of that. That there's, okay, I'm going to raise my property taxes X number of dollars, but I had not seen a very tangible benefit. It's amorphous benefit. But if you broke it down, says, okay, this is going to be $10 million for musical instruments. This is going to be $10 million for science equipment. And we bought such and such equipment. And I would much more. And I think that's what, there's a disconnect there. And I think sometimes there is some, what should I say, overhead. People believe that there's this huge government overhead when you're taxed. And generally there's not. Social Security runs on a very low overhead, something like 2 or 3% is administrative costs. Same things with food stamps. The administrative costs for most government programs is very reasonable compared to the private sector, so especially with healthcare. Administrating private healthcare has much higher administrative costs than government healthcare.
Yeah,
I don't think people get that.
What do you say to critics who claim that poverty is more of a personal failure rather than a systemic issue?
I think there's some truth. There's some people who I would say are allergic to work. And if I had a client like that on my caseload, I would show up at their door at 8:30 and to give them the message, I'm at work, so you should be too. You know, it didn't work most of the time, but I felt better doing it, to be honest. But I think the vast majority of time, people do want opportunity, do want to work, do want things. That's very often logistics. One of the things that keep people out is summer school. You know, when I was a kid, almost every kid went to summer school. Now we only reserve, at least in my area, summer school is only for those kids who are like really marginal students. And for the kids like a junior high age that don't need they still need some adult supervision, but the parent has to work, 9 and 10 hours if you include commuting time. That's a lot of loose time for the child to get into trouble. You know, the most juvenile crime commits in those hours between the time school gets out and the parent gets home. And so if we have more funding, and it made, when I was going to one of the things, when I was a kid, everyone went to summer school, no charge. And also I remember that the local theater, you could go for $1. So my mom could drop me off at the movie theater when I was old enough to go to a movie by myself, but not old enough to be on my own all the time. I was in, a place with other adults, and my friends, and that would be good. So I think we need to do more of that in our society. I don't know how we could accomplish that, but I think that those are challenges.
Do you think that the public overall generally understands how welfare actually works, or do you think that there's a lot of misinformation?
I think there's a lot of misinformation. I really think that there's a lot of people who misunderstand it. There's people who think that people live. I think they would be surprised at the dollar limits that are put on things and how closely it's monitored. If you have a food stamp card, the food stamp worker can see where you spent your money, and if they see you bought a loaf of bread at the 7-Eleven, maybe the next time you meet with the food stamp worker, she will talk to you about that. Do you really think that's a wise spending of your money? That kind of thing. So I think there is a lot of misconception. I think there's a belief that government in general is the belief that there's a lot of overhead, and there's some excessiveness. There was a place where they wanted to build a wall at a school here, just a simple wall so the kids could play handball, and it was some astronomical cost. I'm like, why would it? Because of all the rules they had to follow through. I can understand. Okay, so there's some to be said that there's some efficiencies there, and some things. So there's some truth to the other side of waste and government things. But I've looked at people when I had to go to the DMV a couple of years ago, and I had to wait quite a while, even though I had an appointment. It was probably an hour before I got to be seen. And I looked at all the people. They were like little robots. They're going about their jobs. I didn't see anybody goofing off. I didn't see anybody. They were little robots going about their business, filing this, doing that form. I didn't see any personal inefficiency. Personally, I would have paid a little bit extra to my registration fees or whatever I had to pay that day, and had a few more workers and not have to wait for an hour. But I don't think people see that connection. That, okay, I pay a little bit more in taxes, but I get this better service. Maybe I don't have to go to the DMV every year, but what I do or my neighbor does, they get seen in 20 minutes as opposed to an hour.
And that really is, I think, the messaging problem, is getting people to understand that more investment results in better services and more return. That's not the way things are messaged in this country.
That's true. I think that's quite true. Yeah. And I was frustrated at one time at work, and I started investigating social worker jobs in other states, and found how little they paid.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Not that San Luis Obispo is that generous, but I looked in Hawaii. Hawaii paid about 15% less, and it cost about 10-15% more. Well, are you going to get what are you going to get if a person has a master's degree in social work? Are they going to go to private practice if they've got the hours, or are they going to work in the government if you don't pay enough? And that's one of the things that's the conundrum here. That yes, that you will get, but not that I'm not dissing on people in Hawaii. The few I actually dealt with, the social workers and other people in Hawaii, they were all very, very polite and very good and very efficient and everything, very helpful. But the supply and demand is true in every job.
Yeah, social workers are another profession that don't get paid enough, in my opinion. It's almost thankless work. So I definitely have a lot of appreciation for the work that you've done and for social workers in general. I want to ask you a question that's a little bit off topic. What do you think of proposals for something like a universal basic income? How would that basic income?
I know that's been tried in a few areas, and generally this has been successful. I think what would happen is that even if, say, 97% of the people were good with their income and 3% were bad, that 3% would get such attention that it would not go over well. This is one of these quirky things that I remember back when Ford was president. There was one to stimulate the economy, and so everybody got $100. And somewhere I read along the line that the uptick in 900 sex lives went up, and those $100 went up. So there will be people who will be irresponsible with their money if it comes from the government, and I think that those experiments that were done at the local level will not scale up. I just don't think they would scale up. I think because you have people at the local level who's paying attention to the clients, who are caring, and they come across that it's not the bureaucracy there, it's individuals. So I don't think it's something that would scale up. In essence, we have this, we have all these welfare programs. If you have children, if you don't have children, you're able-bodied enough, because there's a lot of people that fall short of being fully disabled, but they're really not someone who could stand on their feet for 8 hours a day, or who can have the temperament for a job or whatever, or have other issues that make them not quite disabled in a fully medical sense, but they're certainly not going to be very productive as an employee, and they really can't. And so, how do you get part-time people? Part-time people. One of the things that I think that I argue about is that unemployment. When people are chronically unemployed, that's a drain on the economy. That's a drain there. And why don't we subsidize that for a short period of time to a certain amount? So a company, say, let them lie, give them bonuses if they hire so many unemployed people, but don't make it a small amount, so you're not pushing other people about. Make it 3% or something, so that people get, instead of them getting unemployment check for someone who's been chronically employed, have that be a bonus to their employer, to incentivize them and to hire them, and then after a period to decline it, so that people can be lifted up. And that's what you need. You need a lot of transitional services. If you don't have that, then people stay chronically unemployed, or chronically homeless, or chronically whatever, and not successful. And I saw so much of that as a social worker. And we need to be a society that helps people with the understanding that the budget's unlimited, not limited.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the show. And I like I said, I'm going to finish your book. I got to chapter 9.
Okay.
I actually started to read it way before. And then I got distracted because, like I said, I thought we had another guest. And so I jump to a different book that I read for no reason whatsoever. other than of course, I'll interview them later. But so I want to apologize to you for not getting through your book.
Well, Sean, I want to thank you for reading it because a lot of hosts don't do that. They really don't. They won't, they won't take the time to do that, and I really appreciate that.
Oh, I'm enjoying the book. I think it's fascinating.
Good.
And,
Well, I'm glad you like it.
Speaking of the book, let's put it up one more time. Build a Better Bridge. And we've got another book, In Place of the Parent, Inside Child Protective Services, Lance Hillsinger. And people can learn more about you at your website. Let me put that up. LanceHillsinger. Oh, that is not, that was not correct. Oh, sorry about that. Let me fix that. LanceHillsinger.net is where people can learn more about you.
Yep.
And we'll put these links, of course, down in the description as well. Lance, thanks again so much for coming on the program. I really enjoyed having you. I think we've had a fascinating conversation. I've learned quite a bit. And I highly recommend people please go and read these books. And I want to give you a moment to pitch your books and talk about the charity that you're donating to.
Well, again, thank you for having me on the show. Yes, I'm author of 4 books besides the 2 you've mentioned. The third book is Beyond Amelia, Lesser Known Women of Yesteryear. It was inspired by a trip to the History of Diving Museum that my wife and I took. The first movie, underwater movie, was shot by a couple, and she was very much a part of this. And before she could vote, the couple, the woman, she was helping make an underwater movie. So that was kind of what that inspired that book.
Wow.
And then again, faith has been important in my life, so I wanted to write a book about that. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, a court investigator, examines the Gospels. During the Gospels, they put according to the Gospels, the soldiers put a purple robe on Jesus. Well, I asked the question, what they get a purple robe, and what does that mean, and what are the difference between symbolic truths and literal truths? And it may literally be true. A lot of people think of the story of Mary and Joseph and baby being born in a manger, or as being myth, but there's possibly some good reasons why Jesus might have been born outside, and I talk about that in the book. So that's one of the things. And I've been moved by, there's all sorts of things to provide them, but Razom is a humanitarian program. Working in Ukraine, they provide non-military assistance, food, medicine, that kind of thing. This is just the way I want to help in the world. There's many causes, many good causes. This is the one I happen to pick. It has a good rating with Charity Navigator. It's been recommended by Congress and everything. So it's a legitimate organization. So I hope they can go to razom.com to support directly or buy one of my books, and I will make a donation as well. Great.
Thanks again. And we are off for the next 2 weeks. So I will see you all back in 3 weeks. This has been Coup Save America.